Hey there, art nerds. We are now on class 3 of how to draw anything, my class on volumetric drawing. And last class we covered a lot. So we started with another still life to get our hands warmed up and to get some practice in. Then we moved on to doing some studies on surface design and contour lines. We did several of them, and I walked you guys through the process because I figured the more examples I can give you, the more likely it's going to stick, and hopefully the more likely you're going to practice these at home. Let me know down in the comments if you did follow along. I would love to hear from you. We also talked about how surface design wraps around the object and gives it more volume. It makes it easier for the viewer to understand what they're looking at. And we did another still life where we put our surface design and contour lines to practice. Then we talked about doing some exploded view studies of household objects. This is when we take a basic household object and break it down into the individual 3D volumetric shapes that make it up. And we also do studies on the lines, the contour lines in the surface design that help give these objects their personality and help give them definition. And we did several of these as well, and I walked you guys through the process. If you're looking for a shorter version or maybe something to just help you kind of reinforce what we've been talking about, I've also been sharing short versions of some of these tutorials in the shorts tag and over on TikTok, and I hope you guys will check it out. So then we started talking about figure drawing and how to break down a pose. And we're going to actually talk about figure drawing and drawing faces a little bit more today. We did a couple of those studies where we really talked about it quite a bit. And then we talked about how to take those forms, modify them a little bit so that you can draw humanoid objects like robots, Gundams, etc. Not that, that's a Gundam. And then we did an example of how to draw a vehicle using volumetric drawing. After we finished our vehicle, we moved on to drawing a bouquet of flowers together. That was another still life example. And then I walked you guys through how to draw the individual types of flowers in that bouquet. And we did several examples from lilies to chrysanthemums to a different type of mum that's more of a daisy-like shape, to a different type of lily. Yes, our options are kind of limited. It was limited to what the grocery store had. And then finally, we wrapped up by doing a study of the corner of one of the rooms in the house. So today I want to talk about how to light a basic still life. We're also going to talk about lighting a still life utilizing objects. So that's going to give us a chance to study contrast, to study shading, to study how the light affects these objects, and to really explore how for these smoother, more rounded objects, how we can give them some dimensionality. We're also going to talk about fabric, including folds in fabric, which we've talked about here on the channel before. I have some other tutorials for you guys, but I'm really excited to kind of dive into it today and do some drawing from life. We're also going to do a drawing folds live demo. Well, it'll be live for me, but it's easy enough for you guys to recreate at home. Then we're finally going to revisit figure drawing again, and we're also going to touch on face drawing basics. So even though this is a series on how to draw everything and how to draw anything, and I've tried to touch on as many different topics as possible, it's not really feasible for me to hit on everything here in just 3 classes. So I have a lot of great tutorials in my favorite drawing tutorials playlist that I'll link for you guys. So I hope you guys will check it out. And if there's ever anything you want to learn how to draw and you'd like me to show you how to draw it, whether it's cartooning, whether it's doing portraits, whether it's doing more realistic things, whether it's some of the tools and techniques I was taught during art school to do realistic illustrations, please feel free to request that either on my Discord server, the Paint Box, I'll link that down in the description below, via an email, becca.hilburn@gmail.com, or you can let me know down in the comments of this video. Those are the 3 best ways to get a hold of me. I know sometimes people try to reach out to me via Twitter DMs and via Instagram DMs and via Facebook. I don't check my messages. I have ADHD, and that is why I ask you guys, if you want to talk to me, if you want to get a hold of me, Discord card and email are the best ways to do it. So grab your sketchbooks, grab your pencils, and let's get started on volumetric drawing class 3. So let's start with lighting. Lighting can get really complicated, and I'm really just hoping to give you guys a very broad overview so you have kind of a starting point when you're thinking about rendering your shapes and considering lighting. A really important part of lighting is the light source, the area or the source where light is coming from. So here in my art studio, I have it lit up like the sun. I have a lot of lights coming from multiple directions to make sure that I don't get any strong or harsh cast shadows. But I'm going to fiddle with the lights a little bit for you guys so you guys can see how much our volumetric still life here changes just when we change the lighting. So for this example, I've turned off all of the backlighting. I've turned off the top light as well as the spotlight that comes from behind me. So all of the lighting in this example is coming from the front and from the sides. Obviously, the monitor is creating a lot of light. Sorry, that's just something we're going to deal with. That's fine for right now. I've also got a light source coming from up here. I have a light board from behind my table. I have another light source higher up coming from above. I have a light source coming a little bit from behind, and I've got a light source coming from behind on the other direction. So everything is kind of, if this were the audience, there would be no light coming from behind the audience. All the light is coming from the stage. Let's see if I can make a difference. Turned off a little bit more light. So now all of the light is coming from behind our objects. Very little is coming from above our objects. Turn off some more light. And you guys can see how the lighting and the shading really changes as we turn off lights, as we adjust our lighting. You can see how it changes how we perceive the shapes and how we see the forms. Lighting plays a really important part in drawing, especially when we've moved from line drawings where we're just capturing the exteriors of it to when we're moving on towards rendering and potentially adding color. So I am not going to attempt to turn off this monitor because I'd have to lean really far and I might knock everything down. But you guys can see how everything changed just as I turned off and on a few lights. So I'm going to start turning everything back on. You guys can see how that changes again. That's a pretty dramatic difference, huh? That's why light sources can be so important, but it's why I also wanted to wait until class 3 to talk about it so that we had a good understanding of the structures we're drawing before we tried to add too many additional things to consider. I didn't want to overwhelm you guys. So when we're talking about lighting, there's a few different types to consider. We have indoor, which we're talking about right now. We have outdoor, which I'll talk to you guys about in a minute. We have daylight. We have nighttime lighting. We have direct lighting, where the light source is directly pointing at our objects. We have indirect objects where, kind of like the sun, our objects are lit by a light source that's kind of lighting everything almost uniformly. We have colored lighting where we introduce different colors of light, and that can affect how we perceive color. I'm not going to talk about that too much today because we're really focusing more on drawing and less on coloring or color theory. We have single direction lighting where it's one single light source really strongly lighting it. We have multi-directional lighting like what we've got going on right now, where it's multiple light sources lighting everything. We have rim lighting, which you guys kind of saw when I only had the monitor on and everything was lit from behind, except rim lighting tends to be a little bit stronger than backlighting, which is really what we saw when we had the monitor on. So rim lighting would be like when you look at the moon during an eclipse and there's that little rim of light. That would be kind of an example of rim lighting. And I want to talk about all of those just briefly, just to touch on it, just to give you guys some familiarity with it so you know it when you see it. But we're not going to spend a lot of time drawing most of those today. I think for our still life, I'll probably pick a couple of extreme examples and we'll go from there. So this is indoor lighting here in my studio, indoors. This is kind of a unusual example because I have so much lighting going on in here. Most people in their homes have limited light sources unless they're artists or craftspeople and they need to be able to see a lot of color and a lot of detail. So most houses have the lighting up above in the ceiling, so that would be a single light source coming from above, and then they might have some lights off to the side for, you know, very specific purposes like a reading lamp or a desk lamp or a night lamp. And in most people's homes, the lighting is much warmer and yellower than this. This lighting is actually bad for your brain because it tricks your brain into thinking it's sunlight and it'll keep you up all night. So most interior lighting is known as candlelight lighting, so it's warmer and softer and yellower. That drives me batty because I can't perceive colors in that lighting. And I have a really old demonstration video where I demonstrate how that kind of lighting, I mean, it's a terrible video, but it demonstrates the point of how that kind of lighting really skews your ability to perceive color and why ideally you should paint using a natural light lamp, even just on the area that you're painting so that you can better perceive color. And I'll link that in the cards in case you're curious about that. So next we're going to talk about outdoor or exterior lighting. So obviously you have some areas that are in shade, like my front porch here, and you guys can kind of perceive how that affects the color. Everything seems to be cooler, everything seems to be a little bit darker, a little bit bluer, and we're not really getting, since we're in shadow, we're not getting many harsh shadows. However, and I'll adjust the light for you guys so it doesn't get blown out. Once we get into sunlight, we start getting harsher shadows. We start getting more variation in the color, like you guys can see coming from the oak tree. You can also start to see what's known as true color. I'm sorry for that screeching sound. Somebody's brakes are dying. When my Kia used to do that, we'd call it the Chidori. Anyway, so generally this sort of natural lighting, this light source, our single light source, the sun, is definitely casting a lot of light. So generally, if you were trying to gauge color by this, you might want to go for a slightly overcast day where the light is a bit more diffused and it's not so harsh. But this is a good example, a beautiful day of daylight lighting and how that's different from, and how that kind of changes how we perceive the forms versus indoor multi-directional lighting. My little crawfish friend here is a great example of how we have a strong single light source and also a strong shadow. So the house is casting a shadow on his back, but he's lit by the sun on the front. You guys can see we get some pretty extreme contrast between what is lit and what's still in shadow. Even during the day, the quality of daylight changes. So it's sunset now. Everything has kind of a more golden hue to it. Everything feels a little bit richer. The colors feel a little bit deeper. So even throughout the day, the quality of the light and where the shadows are cast in relation to the sun. So you guys can see the sun behind those houses. It's basically blocked off, but if it wasn't, we would get these really long shadows moving in the direction away from the sun. So you can kind of see that with the tree here, how it's moving in that direction, because the sun, our light source, is over in that direction. So this is an example of what overcast lighting would look like during the day. So as you guys can see, very diffused lighting because of the heavy cloud cover. No strong shadows because we're not getting a lot of direct sunlight. Most of our shadows and shading is kind of more subdued. It doesn't stand out quite as much as it would on a bright sunny day. Okay, and finally we have our night view. I should have gone out at twilight, but I was busy, I forgot. So you guys can see it is dark. Most of the shadows that we can see are coming from that street light. So rather than the sun being our main source of light, our main source of light at night is going to be like street lights, house lights, maybe the moon, if the moon is particularly bright that night, sorry. So as you guys can see, different times of day, we get drastically different lighting. Here we have an example of some backlighting. There is some light pollution sneaking in from my windows, but most of the light is coming from behind the objects rather than from the front or the sides. Then, if I were to use my little flashlight, which might not actually be powerful, I'm trying to create some rim lighting. You see where the light is just behind the rim, and you get a more extreme version of backlighting. Let me turn off my monitor and hopefully we can see that a little bit better. And you guys can also see this would be like low interior lighting. So you guys can kind of see. Can I get a better beam on this? I might have to go get my mag light. Yeah, I'm gonna go get my mag light, but you guys can kind of start to see what I'm talking about. With this would be like single directional lighting. And this is really a better one to practice in real life because the camera is going to try to compensate for the lighting conditions. Okay, so that would be a single light source, and it's actually pulled pretty far back. So the further you pull your light source, the more diffuse it's going to be, the more soft it's going to be. Whereas the closer you get with your light source, the more striking it's going to be. And also pay attention to what's going on with the shadows. The shadows can be a great way to kind of give the viewer an idea of where the light source is coming from. And this is an area, since my specialty was comics, not necessarily painting or set design, this is an area where I would really like to spend more time practicing and get a lot stronger at it. I'm not the strongest person at lighting and light sources, but this is something that's relatively easy to practice, and as with most things in art, the more we practice it, the better we're going to get. In a very basic way, these fairy lights are going to help us kind of demonstrate how the color of the light can affect how the objects actually look. Now keep in mind, since these are fairy lights, it's going to be a multi-directional lighting. They're also not particularly powerful, but good for right now. So on the white objects, we get a lot of pink. On the green objects, they appear far less green and much more pink. And the yellow object over here appears much more orange. Hopefully in the future, we can do a whole study together where we utilize different colored lights on different colored objects and maybe do some studies on how that affects the color. But for right now, I just wanted to demonstrate that this is something to consider. Next, I want to do some brief still lifes, just studies, sketches really, to kind of study and analyze how different types of lighting affect our objects. So one of the best ways I've found to learn and to commit things to memory, especially when it comes to drawing, is to actually just do it and take notes. So I'm hoping to do 4 to 5 of these studies just with different amounts of lights in the room turned on and just demonstrate that for you guys in time lapse. Unfortunately, the photos that I've included here for reference don't really reflect what the lighting conditions actually look like. They were all more extreme. My phone camera just kind of equalized everything. That said, I felt like this exercise was a really good one for me because I haven't really spent a lot of time sitting down and studying light and shadow in like a real world still life scenario in a really long time. For some reason, setting up dramatic lighting still lifes is just something that hasn't really occurred to me, and it's something I think I need to be doing more of, especially since I use watercolor really frequently, and this is a great opportunity to practice pushing light and shading for dramatic effect. So I tried to get several different lighting conditions so that I could really study how the light affects the shadow, how the light affects the forms. In a little while, we're going to use real-world objects to create a still life under dramatic lighting, and that's going to also give us the opportunity to study how different materials can affect light and shadow. In this instance, everything is made out of styrofoam, so everything is somewhat light absorbing, so we're not really getting any exciting light differences. So to do this, I recommend you determine where your light source is coming from, and I'm using arrows to kind of indicate that. Then I sketched in my forms. Then I determine my shadows from the form, and I kind of lightly shade them in using my pencil side. And then I determine the shadows that are cast from one form onto another form. Then finally, I find the shadows cast onto our ground surface. So by breaking it down into individual chunks, it's a little bit more manageable. I create a method for thinking about how to do this that I can replicate time and time again, instead of getting kind of lost in the details. Instead of trying to do everything all at once, I'm breaking it down into simpler chunks and focusing on each chunk one at a time. And that allows me to study it a little bit better without feeling bogged down. So as somebody with ADHD who has executive function disorder, I find that sometimes these kind of exercises can be kind of daunting. However, learning how to overcome that also helps me explain to people who are newer to art and who are not super sure how to approach an exercise like this. It allows me to explain it in a way that can be a little bit more approachable, because often what works well for my executive function disorder can work really well for people who are newer to art and don't really have a background for this. And unfortunately, these exercises really kind of cast into relief just how much college and graduate level art courses assume that you took high school level art courses and don't really fill you in or spend much time working on these kind of basics. But these are the kind of basics that you can do very simply and easily at home, and they're really going to help build up that mental library of skills. So this is an exercise that I plan on doing many times in the future. It doesn't have to take long. I think I spent about 5 minutes on each exercise, and drawing them a little bit smaller like this means that I can do more of them more quickly. And all I really changed was the light source. All I really changed was how many lights were on in my room. If you want to replicate this, I would recommend having a really strong light source and having a room that you can work in where you can shut off the majority of the lights. So for my final one, I drew it a little bit larger. I have almost all my lights on. I think I didn't turn the top light on for this one. And by this point, with all these lights on, we've really blasted out all of our shadows. We're losing a lot of our form, our definition, and contrast. So for someone like me who basically works on the surface of the sun in terms of lighting, taking a step back and doing these kind of lighting studies in low light situations is a great reminder for just how much shadow and contrast should be in a majority of the pieces that I'm doing, because not every room, not every situation is going to be lit as brightly as my work studio. So we just completed 5 still lifes. The only thing that changed in between each one is the lighting. I increased the lighting with every step. So we go from some pretty, I don't want to say dramatic lighting, because this was just a little bit of light pollution coming in to light the room. So it wasn't pitch black, but everything is very flat and very the same. And that's kind of interesting, because when you have very little lighting and then when you have a lot of lighting, it kind of has the same amount of contrast. It's just that everything in this image would have been darker, whereas everything in my very brightly lit one, our final one, would have been much lighter. But everything has kind of the same value range. It just depends on where it is in the value spectrum. So either very dark or very light. Things start getting interesting though once we start introducing just a few lights. So this is a single light source, and we're really getting some nice, dramatic, easy to see shadow. And I think part of my problem is with understanding lighting is that I tend to have everything so brightly lit, or the reference photos I'm working from are so brightly lit, that you don't get that really nice dramatic contrast in shadow. Then we add 2 light sources and we start to get these sort of splitting shadows onto our foreground surface, which makes for a lot of fun and very interesting lighting study. Then for our third, we have 3, so we almost have like stage lighting going on, where it's coming from not the audience, so not the front necessarily, but from behind and from the side, and things are starting to flatten out a bit, but we still do get some really interesting shadows and we can see our shapes a little bit better. And then for our 5th and final study, our shadows have flattened out quite a bit. The most interesting shadows are actually those underneath our objects. but we can see everything pretty clearly. So these studies were actually a lot of fun. I took a lot of notes, as you guys saw, and I learned a lot, and this would be something I'd be very interested in continuing as part of my art practice. And it's an exercise I highly recommend you try out for yourself. So next, we're going to set up a still life using real world objects. I'm going to pick one of our lighting conditions, probably something with some dramatic lighting, and we're going to practice drawing a real world object still life with dramatic light. So I've got my real world object still life set up. I've got 3 light sources going on. We've got one coming from slightly behind to my left, one coming directly behind, and then one coming from above and maybe slightly behind from the right as well. So fairly backlit, so we're actually getting some interesting shadows. We would be seeing a lot of like highlights, some rim lighting, and we would also get some nice strong core shadows as it faces us, the viewer. So for our still life, I really wanted to work with the same kind of dramatic lighting that I had for our volumetric still life, and I'm approaching it in much the same way. I sketched out the overall form that my still life took, and now I'm working on kind of breaking it down into individual shapes, sketching everything very loosely, holding my pencil very loosely. This is mostly just to help me figure out placement, what is overlapping, where is everything, and make sure that I get all my objects in. Once I have it kind of sketched in, I can go back in and tighten some of the details, but I don't want this to get too tight just yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refine the details a bit, get some of those shapes down, and then I'm going to go in and add my shading with the blue side of the pencil. And this is to really make the shading apparent, to make it really easy for you guys to see what I'm doing, to make it really obvious. Now, I'm not trying to go for neat and tidy shading. We're not doing cross hatching. We're not using like stippling or other types of shading techniques. There are some great books that explain how to do that, and I believe Alfonso Dunn's channel talks about different shading techniques in some detail. So I highly recommend you check his work out. I'm really going for what gets the job done. So I'm holding the pencil very loosely and using the side of the blue pencil to softly start marking in some of our shadow. I'm blocking everything in. I am going to go in a little bit later on once I've got like the major forms kind of blocked in, and this is also helping with kind of delineating one form from another. And I'm going to add more detail, and I'm also going to add more depth to this. But for right now, I'm just trying to kind of block in the major areas of light and shadow. Once I finish blocking in the major areas of light and shadow, I'm going to go back in with the red side and add further details, including surface design. So I'm trying to utilize what we talked about in class 2 with cross contour, contour, and surface design to give us an idea of the shapes, along with what we talked about in class 1, using basic volumetric forms to help us block in more complicated forms. And I am adding the topic for today's class, utilizing lighting to really help push those forms so that we get more volumetric drawing. And I didn't spend super long on this still life. I think about 20 minutes. The longer you spend, the more detail you can get, the better you can get. But when you're just starting out with drawing, I think it's really important to just get as much in as possible, do as many different studies as possible until you're really confident with it. So at this stage, I wouldn't really recommend you spend a lot of time refining a single still life. I would actually recommend you do multiple still lifes and just keep practicing over and over and over again until you're confident with utilizing those basic volumetric forms. You're confident with utilizing your surface design and cross contour lines to show the different planes of your forms, and you're fairly confident in adding in shading and lighting to really help give those forms volume. I would wait until you're confident in those 3 areas before really sitting down and spending a lot of time working on a still life. Unless that idea just inspires you and you just want to do that, in which case, find a way to work it in. I am all about you guys drawing what you enjoy, drawing what you love, and spending time doing things you love, even if you're not the best at it, because that's what's going to keep you improving. That's what's going to keep you making art, rather than drawing things that you don't have any interest in, or that you find boring, or that you find painful to do. That's going to kind of push you away from art. So one of the great things about these still lifes is that you can use whatever objects inspire you, whatever makes you happy, whatever you enjoy drawing. You can draw your collections of different things. You can draw things from nature. You can do a combination of them. All I really recommend is you try to get a variety of different objects, a variety of different shapes, and a variety of different materials so that you can really improve. Okay, so I have finished my real world object still life. And when I was working on this still life, I sketched in the basic overall form, broke it down into loose versions of the individual forms, went ahead and blocked in the shading using the blue pencil. Then I went back and I added some additional details with the red pencil, including surface design. And then finally, I went back in and I blocked in further shadows with the blue pencil and also did the cast shadows on the ground. And that's a method that I find works well for me so that I'm not confusing myself with too many details at too early a starting point. So if you're having trouble doing these sort of lighting studies, maybe finding ways to kind of chunk it into individual chunks and work on each chunk at a time. So, basic sketch, basic lighting, then adding details, then adding detailed shading. That might be a better way to approach a still life like this if you find that you're confusing yourself as you go. So I have one more lighting exercise that we're going to do today. We're actually going to practice drawing a figurine, so a human-esque figure in these kind of lighting conditions, and that'll be a great segue to talking about drawing the human form and the human face again. Okay, so our segue between shading and going over figures and faces again is we've got a Miku figurine here. This is going to provide a great example for us to study the shading under the same lighting conditions that we use for two of our still lifes. So we've got consistent lighting situation. This will help us actually be able to really study things and figure things out. So often here on the channel, but also in my day-to-day drawing life, I'm working from other people's figure reference as part of my figure studies, and that means I don't get any control over the lighting, and sometimes the lighting doesn't really tell you much about the forms that you're looking at, and it can be a lot harder to understand what you're drawing without that lighting or without that ability to pick something up and rotate it into space. So if you are able to do an exercise like this at home from your own display figurines, if you happen to have any, it could be a great opportunity to better understand the human body a little bit using lighting and shading and volume. So I wanted to utilize a figurine in this exercise because this gives me a chance to practice drawing a more humanoid figure under this sort of dramatic lighting. I can't always control the lighting that I have when I'm working from reference, and I sometimes can't find the kind of lighting that I'm looking for. A little bit later on in today's class, we are going to draw some figures utilizing dramatic lighting from Adorkastock, but in general, you can't always find what you're looking for, so sometimes you have to kind of make do with what you've got. Another way you could practice doing this, especially if you don't have any of these kind of figurines, would be to use one of those artist dummies. Generally, I'm not really a big fan of those because they're very difficult to pose and they don't hold the pose very well and they have very limited poses. But to just practice dramatic lighting on a humanoid form, that would probably work quite well. So much like with the still life, I blocked it in using some basic shapes. I haven't really added a whole lot of details. Then I went in using the side of the blue pencil and did I kind of blocked in the major forms of shading. And then once I have that blocked in, I'm going back in with the red pencil and adding details and kind of working back and forth, adding those details and then adding my shading. And I'm not aiming for something that looks really good. This is just a study, and I'm utilizing the red and the blue pencil to kind of show the difference between the underdrawing, like the sketch that I'm doing for this, and the actual areas where we're getting some light and some depth from the light source rather than from the paint job on the figurine. And we're going to talk more about drawing figures, but we also talked about drawing figures a lot in class 2, and I've got some great tutorials here on the channel where I really talk about drawing figures. So don't worry, I've got you covered. Check the description below as well as the cards for more great tutorials if you're interested in learning how to draw the human figure, or if you're interested in learning how to draw cartoony figures. So what's fun about this exercise is if we'd had time, and maybe I'll go back and do this exercise again, we could treat it the same way we treated the initial volumetric studies, where we did 5 different studies under different lighting conditions, and the only thing we really changed were the lighting. And that would give us a great opportunity to see how different light sources and different light placements can drastically affect the shading on the figurine and what gets blocked off by what. This can be particularly helpful when drawing the face, although I have to say using an anime figure like this is not going to help you with drawing the face, realistically, with shading. That's because anime faces are often very, very simplified, and they don't necessarily have strong facial features that might cast shadow onto other facial features. We practiced with a figurine. Now we're going to practice with a couple of reference photos that have really strong lighting. So we've practiced with the figurine. Now we're going to work from reference. This comes from Adorkastock. I was able to find 2 poses that have decently strong lighting. So I'm starting out by sketching in the basic human figure, utilizing my advanced stick figure drawing technique. This is part of what I teach when I'm teaching from stick to figure. I always use this kind of skeletal mannequin form first to really capture the pose, and then I use volumetric drawing to kind of flesh out the pose. And for this sketch, I'm really trying to focus not just on the details of the body, but really capturing the shading, which is something we haven't done. So we've done it a little bit in class 2. It's not something I focus on as much as I ought to. The more you practice something like this, the better you're going to get. And I really want to seek out some reference that has some really, really strong light sources and really, really strong cast shadows, so I can practice with that a bit more. This whole class has really brought to my attention how the lighting in my studio, while it's good for YouTube, has actually been detrimental to my improvement, especially in understanding shading as an artist. And that's an area I definitely want to work on more. So I'm doing some basic blocking in with the shading, kind of working back and forth, adding in details and refining them, and also adding in shading and refining my shading by working back and forth with the red and blue pencils. If you're working along at home, don't feel like you need to work with a red and blue pencil for this. That's just for demonstration purposes. I recommend working with, say, a nice soft B pencil, because you can get a good range of depth with that. And also, don't start off with your darkest shades. Start off with really, really light shades, because you can always build them up darker. So here is another great pose, very dynamic, a lot of fun to draw with some decent shading. It would be nice if I could have gotten a little bit more contrast going on. I also wanted to demonstrate for you guys how we're utilizing cylinders to draw the arms and the legs. So I did a bit of an exploded view next to her bent leg, just so you guys could see how the cylinders actually change direction in space, so that we can better capture the dimensionality of the pose. So this is very similar to the first one in that I sketched the basic pose first, and now we're utilizing the side of the blue pencil to add in some light shading, going back with the red pencil to tighten things up, and then we're going to do more darker, more intense shading with the blue side of the pencil. So if you're working with a softer lead than I am, you're going to be able to get a lot more range of shade. With this pencil, these pencils are kind of scratchy and they're kind of hard, so I'm not able to get as much nuance in the shade as I would like, which is why I recommend that you guys work with something like a B pencil, something softer. Another plus side to that is if you find that you've gone too far, you can actually use the eraser to pull that back up, and that might be something worth demonstrating for you guys later. Spent a fair amount of time studying lighting and how different lighting conditions or different light sources can affect how we're perceiving what's right in front of us. We also did a figure study using a figurine just to kind of practice getting some of that shading in. And we also did a couple of studies from photos with really strong light sources. So next we're going to talk about folds and fabric, and then we're going to wrap it up by doing a clothed figure study and talking about drawing faces. So we have talked a lot about lighting, and we've talked a little bit about drawing the human figure, especially in relation to lighting. Let's talk about folds now, specifically fabric and clothing folds. So if you are interested in learning more about this topic, then, and I've talked about this here on the channel before, but Jack Ham's Drawing the Head and Figure is a fantastic resource for this. So a lot of his stuff on drawing clothing and drawing folds is what most artists on the internet are going to be referencing. So I figured I would just cut to the chase and mention this book first. And it's really not expensive over on Amazon. I think it's in like the $15 range. And it seems to be in print fairly often. And there's just a lot of great advice, as well as a diagram that showcases all the different types of folds. Because if you kind of understand what causes a fold in fabric, or the common points where fabric will fold, you can kind of fudge it when you're, drawing from imagination, which is important because even though it's great to work from reference whenever possible, sometimes you just can't find that specific clothing reference for that specific motion for that specific body type. So understanding how to create your own folds and what causes folds in fabric can be really helpful. Now, there are also some other great resources online. Frankly, if you Google like folds tutorial, you should be able to find a lot. So these are from a live stream that I did a while back, and these are just different fold studies, notes from other people's fold studies, kind of a combination of Jack Ham, what I could find online, as well as what I was finding while referencing and while talking about it. So generally, when we're talking about clothing, pipe folds like pleats in a dress or in curtains, those are going to come up pretty frequently. And zigzag folds or compression folds, these come up often when fabric is wrapped around a cylinder or a tube and bunches up. So like pants or the sleeves on a jacket or the sleeves on a shirt. And typically heavier fabrics don't move as much as lighter fabrics. So like a chiffon or a silk, you're going to get a lot of movement. You're going to get a lot of folds in it because it's very lightweight. It can compress very easily. Whereas denim or a velvet, it's very stiff. It's very dense. It's not going to compress nearly as much. And we have spiral folds like the kind you get around the bottom of the arm, the forearm, as it twists in space. Also have notes on areas where folds typically form, so like creases at elbow joints or knee joints. Half lock folds usually occur when the fabric, like rounded fabric around a cylindrical form, kind of creases into itself. So like the bins at the knees when you're sitting, if you're wearing jeans. As well as how fabric tends to overlap. And what creases, they call these emanating creases, like light tension points. So just like, maybe like, along your side, if you were like bent over on one side and the fabric kind of crunched together, or say there's a button and the fabric is kind of pulling away, you'd have your point of stress and then the fabric kind of radiating away from the point of stress. And just studies with different types of fabrics. These were done from reference. More of the same, just to kind of better understand that. Because if you understand, even if you don't plan on drawing realistically, if you understand it, then you can develop a shorthand for it that makes sense. And it gives your drawings and your art a little bit more dimensionality. So talking about tension, where the fabric would be really straight and taut, or at least laying flat against the body. And then kind of the opposite of tension, where it's all bunched up and built up. And this can be really played up for kind of cartooning and animation purposes, where you have that combination of straights against curves, which makes something feel really more dynamic and lively. And then we have like drapery style folds, like a diaper fold where you have 2 points and it's hanging from the midpoint. This is also true for scarves and sometimes shows up on like skirts. And I'll try to dig up the live stream. I'm always looking for this live stream and I can't ever seem to find it, but I definitely remember doing this as a live stream during a power hour. I'll try to dig it up and link it for you guys because I'm able to go into it in a lot more detail there. And then we kind of talked about drop folds. These are also called like tubular folds, and they're kind of like a pipe fold where the fabric has formed pipes and then it's kind of laying flat against itself. And then you have folds that are created as the body is in movement, and that's really going to kind of vary. As well as inert, dead, and floor folds where the fabric has just fallen to the ground. There's nothing holding it up. There's nothing creating any tension other than the stiffness of the fabric itself. And I mean, you can get really, really granular about it. So like ripple folds where it might fold, kind of crease or compress. They're kind of like the spiral folds that we saw with like fabric against a cylindrical form. Same kind of thing, usually around the midriff. And then just different types of compression, how fabric tends to compress against itself. So soft fabric tends to have rounder curves. Stiff fabric tends to have more angular curves. Tight fabric is less likely to crease. Thin fabrics are more likely to crease. Thick fabrics are less likely to crease. All folds are either crush folds or tension folds. Folds emanate from tension points, protrusions, and changes in the plane, and folds tend to fan out. Man, you would think I'd be like, with all the studies that I do and all the notes that I take, you'd really think I'd be a better artist. Unfortunately, that ADHD brain just doesn't want to hold on to it if I don't practice it all the time. So that's one of the reasons I really kind of push the method of doing it several times over to try and make it a little more sticky for your brain. Otherwise, you're learning all these things and they may or may not stick. And when I talk about natural talent, honestly, this is one of the things that I think natural talent is, the ability for your brain to actually grasp this the first or the second time you've learned it, instead of having to learn it every other year. So more movement, more folds and stress. You can kind of see that here where we have the arm in a neutral pose. Then we have a semi-flex where we have a half lock fold at the elbow, and then it's curled up, and we have a lot of the half lock fold, and then we have some spiral folds. And then I have a study from the Jack Ham book with all the notes in it, because like I said, for me to learn how to do things, I have to draw them. So sketching them and copying them over into my sketchbook and thinking about them as strategically as possible really kind of helps me remember things. So then I did a bunch of studies of half lock folds from, reference. Zigzag folds, and kind of showing how they would bunch up on, say, like sweatpants as well as on jeans. Some more skirt and drapery studies with pipe folds. All right, and that is what I've got for folds. So I'll dig up that live stream for you guys, but this is enough to kind of get you guys started with some references to kind of lead you along the way. And I'll be sure to link down in the description below some additional resources if you guys would like to take it a little bit further. I would not necessarily recommend studying from my studies, because these studies they were done for me, and I think they were done live. So they're not as clean as they should be, so they might be a little bit more difficult to understand. Whereas online, there's some really nice, clean studies that are a little easier to understand. And basically, once you know the different types of folds, you start looking for them in your reference and you start making mental notes of them. So, of course, now that we've talked about folds, it's time for us to complete a drawing exercise. So I have here some fabric. It has stripes on it, so that should hopefully make it a little bit easier for us to understand the forms. I'm gonna dim the lights, although I was editing yesterday's video and I realized that you guys can't see the lighting effects nearly as much as I can, which is so unfortunate because my camera adjusts for it. But I'll dim the lights so that we can get a little bit more shading and contrast, because right now, as you guys can see, we can see some of the folds, but a lot of that shading is blown out by how brightly lit it is in here. So I've dimmed the lights just a little bit so that we can actually start getting some really nice shadow and contrast. So during this still life, I'm going to be paying attention to how the folds look draped over our object, as well as some of the folds and draping we've gotten over here. I'm also going to be paying attention to the shading, but As you guys will notice, this has a stripe pattern. This is actually really useful. I did this intentionally because it's going to tell us what direction these planes are moving so I can more effectively study the movement of the fabric. So this is where surface design, which we talked about in class 2, starts coming back into play and really gives us an idea of what we're dealing with and what the forms actually look like. So the main theme for class 3 is lighting and shadow. We talk about a bunch of different things here in class 3, but we are always bringing it back to doing these lighting studies. So unfortunately, the photo doesn't really represent the light situation as much as I would like. I wanted something a little bit darker so that we could really start getting some of those shadows. In fact, I could have gone even darker than that and gotten even more dramatic shading. So for this fold still life, I kind of tried to capture the basic form, the basic shape of the fabric, and now I'm breaking it down into the larger folds, the larger masses. Now, honestly, drawing folded fabric like this, it's a bit like drawing crumpled paper. It can get very confusing. You can get kind of turned around on yourself. You can misjudge the distances between the folds. So it's not the easiest exercise, but it's one well worth practicing, particularly if you're looking to get better at lighting, shadow, and drawing fabric. So once I have the basic folds kind of blocked in, I'm using the side of my blue pencil to start really knocking in some shadow. And this really helps the fabric make more sense to me mentally. I'm also utilizing a fabric that has a stripe pattern on it. So we have that surface design, we have those contour lines telling us what directions the fabric is moving in. It also really highlights how much the fabric twists and turns on itself as we kind of draped it and folded it. It's going, as you guys can see, with the lines going every which way, it's really moving quite a bit. Now I'm going to wait until almost the end of the still life to kind of block in that surface pattern, but I do think studying the direction and the movement of the fabric is important. So that is definitely something that I'm going to do. But for right now, I'm kind of tightening up and kind of cleaning up my folds. I'm adding in additional shading. I'm trying to bring in some additional nuance. Now, it took me about 20 minutes in real time to do this study. I'm working pretty large. This is a 9 by 12 sketchbook, and I filled the whole page. I could have gone even larger than this. So feel free to take the amount of time you need to complete this still life. We're not on a timer. We're not on a rush. Really, the only limitation for things like this is just the limitations of how much time we have together as a class. But when you're doing these at home, feel free to spend as much time as you need to do this and feel confident about it. I would also recommend, so generally I tell you guys to use color pencils, and don't worry about it. Just redraw it if you feel like you're making mistakes, because the focus isn't perfection. But in this instance, I did notice some scale discrepancies that I really would have liked to have corrected to better reflect my understanding of it and to kind of cement that in my brain. So this is one of those examples where if you need to use an erasable pencil, please feel free to. So I'm using the side of my pencil to really sketch in our stripes on the fabric. Now, it's not a one-to-one. I didn't count the stripes and try to get it perfect. That wasn't really my goal. My goal was to reflect the movement of the fabric and also to try and reflect how the fabric divots in and how the pattern on the fabric reflects that. So this is a sketch. It's a study. It's not really meant to be 100% perfect. This isn't meant to be a portfolio piece, but a piece designed to help me better understand fabric and its movement. All right, so that is our finished study. Keep in mind, this isn't really meant to be a portfolio piece. This is really just designed as an exercise to help us better understand folds, to help us better understand shading, and to help us figure out surface design a bit more. So I'm going to do another one of these. I actually have some plaid cloth, so it's got a crisscross pattern on it. And then we're going to move on to drawing the clothed figure. So I'm setting up another fabric still life, this time using plaid fabric, and I'm draping it over a head mannequin form. I thought that might give us more interesting forms that we can study from. So again, I start by sketching in the very basic outline shape. This is going to kind of help me with placement and help me make sure that I can kind of get everything in there. I'm using the side of my pencil and holding it really lightly because I'm really just sketching. I want to make sure that everything's still kind of light in case I have to correct it later on, because I can't erase, so I would have to draw on top of it. And this is a lot easier on the hand when you're utilizing the side of the pencil rather than utilizing the point. You're kind of hatching in or carving in these larger shapes. So once I'm fairly satisfied with my sketch of the draped fabric, I'm going back in and adding my shading and my shadows, trying to really kind of capture how the fabric has moved. So a plaid pattern like this, much like the stripes, is really useful for telling us how the fabric's moving. I would actually say the stripes are probably more useful since they only go in one direction. You can really see which direction the fabric's moving, whereas with a plaid like this, it becomes a little bit more muddied as to what direction the fabric's moving. So if you're doing this at home, I would recommend you start out with the stripes going in a single direction, and then if you want to progress, if you want to do something different, move on to your kind of cross-hatch plaid stripes. So much like with the other fabric study, I started out with really light blue shading, and then I'm moving on to my heavier blue shading. Again, you don't want to start with your heaviest, your darkest values. You want to start with really, really light values because you can always go darker, but once you've gone too dark, it's much more difficult to go lighter. Of course, if you're working in graphite, you can pull highlights back out. That is a well-accepted technique. But it is going to hit a point where you've gone so dark that you can't pull it back to the white of the paper. So that's just something that you might want to keep in mind. So once I have my shading kind of blocked in, I'm using the side of my red pencil to really kind of start hatching in my surface design, and I'm actually going in one direction first, kind of focusing on the lines going in that direction, really trying to pay attention to the movement and how they move with the fabric. And then once I've finished doing one direction, I'm going to move and do the opposite direction. And it's just a way of kind of chunking the task to make it more approachable and to make it a little bit easier for me to understand and to see rather than getting overwhelmed with all the details. That's a big part of learning how to be an artist, is breaking things down into smaller details so that you're not overwhelmed and so that you can complete the task. So now we're going to take what we've been practicing and kind of put it all together, and we're going to practice drawing some clothed figures from the Sartorialist. And I'll have a link in the description below. I'm also going to include the photo that I'm referencing just so you guys can kind of get an idea for why I'm doing what I'm doing. So for class 3, I really wanted to put together exercises that build on each other, and that makes sense. So now we're working on the clothed human form, and I'm using reference from the Sartorialist. And I tried to pick people who were wearing interesting outfits and had a decent amount of folds and shading going on so that we could really focus on those two elements. So when I'm drawing a clothed figure, there's often parts of the body that I can't really see. Things are often very obscured. So what I generally will do is I'll just kind of lightly block in the stuff that's covered by clothes and just use that as a placeholder so that I can position the limbs that are actually more visible. So once I have everything kind of lightly, roughly blocked in using very basic forms, I can then go in and work on adding the details and refining things. So we kind of talked about this in class 2 a bit, where we're starting with the larger forms, and once we have everything kind of established and everything kind of sketched in, we can work our way through and start adding details. And typically I try to add my details all at the same pace. And if you watch my watercolor tutorials, you'll notice that as well. I try to avoid getting too detailed in any one area first, because if I end up not liking it, I don't want to have to like scrap the whole thing. So once I've got everything kind of blocked in, I can start adding in shading using the blue side of my pencil. So this person has a great fur coat, but I'm really not that interested in capturing the texture of the fur today. I'm more interested in capturing the shadows and how the shadows look on the fur, as well as how the shadows look on the body. So as you guys know, I usually like to do multiple examples so that we can really cement these ideas. We can really start getting practice in. And for me, it's typically like multiples of 3. So we're going to do 3 of these studies. This person is wearing this really cool long red coat on top of a dress. So it gives us an opportunity to draw some pipe folds and some drapery. And the shading on this one is kind of muted because this person is standing in shadow. So we're not going to be getting any really harsh or interesting shadows because they're not standing in a direct light source. So this one is really more about the overlap of fabrics and how the different fabrics fold on top of one another and how they create folds in the fabric itself. Now our third one, all of these are coats, and I think it's just because it's winter, so the Sartorialist has a lot of winter wear, which is fine. No complaints here. We get a lot of overlapping fabric. We get a lot of different kinds of fabric, a lot of different fabric weights and fabric stiffnesses. This person is wearing a scarf, and the scarf is made of a finer fabric. Maybe it's like a cashmere, so it kind of folds in on itself. They're also wearing a heavy coat, and we do get some interesting half-lock folds in the sleeves, as well as some almost pipe folds as the fabric itself hangs down, but generally the fabric is too heavy, too stiff to fold as much as a lighter fabric would. And then this person is also wearing what looks like to be a wool vest underneath, and it's pulled fairly taut, so we don't have a whole lot going on in terms of folds, but we do have a really interesting fabric pattern going on that gives us an idea of how the fabric is moving and how it's kind of undulating on itself. So it's a great opportunity to practice several different techniques all at once. Also, this person is standing in a I think it's probably an overcast day when this photo was taken. So the shadows aren't super striking, but they're more striking than in the photo we were working with previously. So we have a little bit more that we can practice and study from. We're going to wrap things up with a tutorial on drawing faces, and this is a very, very basic, very general tutorial. I have other tutorials on drawing faces here on the channel. I'll be sure to link those down in the description below. Consider this kind of a crash course, since this is how to draw everything. And really, the key to drawing everything is draw the biggest shape and then just break it down and break it down and break it down and add details as you go. So those of you who have watched the channel for a while and you know me, you know I am a comic artist with a cartoonier art style, and really that's what I would prefer to focus on. If you guys are interested in seeing how I go about approaching more realistic portraits, let me know down in the comments below. That can be a totally different video. But today I am going to just kind of, not briefly, but more briefly than normal, demonstrate how I go about breaking down the head using volumetric drawing and constructive drawing. And then after we do that, we're going to do some shadow studies using a mannequin head. So a while back, I made these demonstrator head forms out of styrofoam. Actually, I have a video here on the channel on how to go about doing it. This one is a little bit worse for wear. The face has gotten kind of crunched in. It's probably about time for me to maybe remake it. But I think these still work well as a physical manipulative to kind of demonstrate what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll be sure to link the video where I show you guys how to make your own. Hopefully you can make it look a little bit nicer than I did. But basically, when we're drawing the head, we're going to be starting with a sphere as our basic shape. We're going to subdivide that sphere so that we have kind of our markings, our ley lines, if you will, for where we're going to put all the different features. We're going to cut a chunk off where the neck attaches to the head, and we're also going to shave off some on the side, so flatten out our skull just a little bit. And then we are going to add the front part of the face, the shovel part of the face is what I usually describe it when I'm talking to younger artists. So let's do that on paper. I'm going to demonstrate 4 different views. We're going to have our front facing, so F. We are going to have our, maybe I'll do 5 views for you guys. 3/4 view, still somewhat front facing. We're going to have our profile view, P. We're going to have our back view, B. And then we're going to have our 3/4 view facing away. And I'm just going to demonstrate how to kind of break down a basic volumetric face or a basic volumetric skull shape. This is how it was taught to me while I was at SCAD. So we've got our sphere. I've divided it in half vertically and horizontally. We're going to go ahead and shave a little bit off the sides. And if you're interested in learning how to do this, Glen Vilppu talks about this, Andrew Loomis talks about this, and Hogarth all talk about this, and I will link their books down in the description for you guys. We're going to extend the face downward and make kind of a shovel shape. Okay, so we've got kind of our basic head. I'm going to doodle in a neck so you guys can see. So now we're going to talk about facial landmarks. So halfway from the top of the skull to the bottom of the circle is our eye line. We're going to divide the face in half as well because most people's faces are fairly symmetrical. So generally, to space my eyes, I use at least one eye width so I can get that spacing just right. Then generally, I kind of freehand an oval shape around the eyes. You guys have probably heard me talk about the domino mask before. This is just to help me place the eyebrows. So halfway between the horizontal midway point and the top of the head, that's going to be where the hairline starts on most people. I mean, obviously, there are exceptions to every rule, but this is just landmarks and rule of thumb. Halfway down from the eye line to the bottom of the face, generally, is where the nose would go. And then halfway from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the face is where the mouth would go. From the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose, generally, that's the ears. Obviously, some people have smaller ears. Some people have smaller noses. Again, just all rule of thumb. And that is kind of the basics for front of the face landmarks. So generally, when I'm marking faces in, I'll put in a triangle just to kind of mark in the nose. And then for the chin, I'll often do a very small oval like that, just to kind of help me figure everything out. Okay, 3/4 view. Everything's the same. We've just rotated it in space a little bit. We've moved it in that direction. So this is when the slice on the side of the face becomes a bit more apparent. So we're going to draw a crosshair in the middle of that. Make this longer to better match this face. Usually I just default to drawing Kara. I'm going to extend my midway line, my vertical midway line, to kind of follow the contour of the face, since most people's faces do protrude a little bit there. So halfway from the top of the head to the bottom of the, well, to the bottom of the circle, sorry, is our eye line. I place my middle eye along the center of the face, and then I can evenly space out my actual eyes on either side, draw in the eyebrow circles. So halfway from the eye line to the top of the head is our brow line, where the hairline comes in. Halfway from the eye line to the bottom of the face is our nose. Halfway from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the face is the mouth. And I'll just be cheap, instead of actually indenting the face to show the brow bone, we'll just kind of scoop in. Okay, so we have our shovel shape that kind of connects to this part here. So we take that sliced off bit of the circle and bring it all the way down. Then we connect this to this center line, and then kind of keeping everything in perspective, we'll add our ear on that center line and bring the head around back, and then add our neck. So this is our profile view. I'm going to sketch in that slice, kind of tighten up that circle, divide it in half, bring the front of the face down, bring the side of the face down, usually to the bottom of the circle, but sometimes it can go a little higher. So the back of the skull is actually flattened out. That's where the neck connects. So I'm flattening it out already. I'm going to go ahead and draw my center eye, draw my actual eye, draw my eyebrow circle. Halfway from the top of the head to the eye line is our brow line. Halfway from the bottom of the circle to the eye line is the nose. down. And like I said, I have more in-depth tutorials on how to draw faces here on the channel, so I will be sure to link those for you guys. This is just a quick demonstration. So here is the back. We've got our circle. So we're gonna shave off the sides. And then remember, the bottom of the circle flattens out, but you can usually still see the face, at least a little bit. Add in the neck. If you want to be really particular about it, you can go ahead and kind of sketch the eyes and the eyebrows through, just so that you know where to do the ears. So when I'm drawing the backs of the ears, actually change them a little bit and draw them as like kind of like these little seashell sort of shapes. And then finally, our 3/4 view, turning away from the face. It's basically like doing it, and I'm going to draw it through, so I'm going to draw the other side of the face. Connect it. Draw through so that you guys can see where the neck goes. We'll indent it a little bit so you guys can see where the eyes would go. And then for the ear, turned away. Usually I'll do something kind of similar to this, where I do kind of like a C-esque shape, like the shell of the ear. Sometimes, depending on the size of the person's nose, you can see some of their nose and some of their eyelash. So that just kind of helps give people an idea of what they're actually looking at. Bring in the brow line. And there you have 5 very messy views of different angle or different turns for the human face. So volumetric human head construction is one of my favorite things to teach, because once people get it, it really opens them up to being able to draw faces, whether it's realistic or cartoony, consistently over and over and over again. However, it is really difficult for most people to grasp. And it was something I really struggled with too. Like, I understood the basics and I could see immediately why it was valuable for me to learn it, but I really had a hard time and had to practice a lot to be able to draw it. And to be really blunt about myself, when it comes to realistic drawing, I can't always do the volumetric head as nicely as I would like, because I do it in a cartoony way so often. So since this is something that I like to teach, but my students often struggle to grasp what I'm trying to get at and the importance of it, I wanted to try and make a physical manipulative that would be a little bit easier to understand. So here's the process for me marking up that already creepy looking wig mannequin using alcohol markers to kind of mark out the different landmarks and different ley lines on the human face to hopefully make it a little bit easier to see and a little bit easier to understand. I find that sometimes having these physical manipulatives that they can actually hold and look at and rotate in their hands to be really helpful. So I was hoping that this would really make things a lot easier. Now, something else that would make this a lot easier would be to have class sessions that are longer than an hour, because honestly, volumetric head drawing is an hour-long class in and of itself, without talking about drawing in a cartoony style or drawing facial features. It's well worth study on its own. And while I was at SCAD, drawing the human head was its own class. So, you know, trying to cram so much into 1 hour is it's definitely a challenge, and it's one I'm not always successful at, but I'm always trying to find different ways that I can make the subject matter a little bit more accessible and make it a little bit easier to understand. So with this styrofoam wig mannequin, I'm subdividing the head. We're doing it vertically right now, and I'm preparing to do it horizontally. to just kind of demonstrate. Now, I wish this was a more realistic head. This is a stylized head. The facial features are really very alien looking and they're really off. I might have to track down a better kind of just base default human head. But for the time being, it works to serve my purposes, and especially until I can find a better one. It might be better to even find a male head, because I don't know, this one, the features are just so soft, and I complain about this a little bit later on. So now I am drawing the area on the head that I normally would tell you guys to flatten out or to slice off. So on this wig form, it's left rounded, which is partially why this person's face looks so wide and so strange. But I'm trying to sketch the circles on so you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. Next, I'm sketching in the jawline, which, again, on this thing, not as great, not as, I'm kind of having to like draw things that aren't there so that you guys can see them, which just incentivizes finding a better wig head. I'll be real, I bought this at Walmart in the craft section, and at the time I bought it, I didn't realize how not idealized, but how stylized it was until I started marking it up, and then I was like, oh, this doesn't work as well as I had hoped. But that's okay, you know, it's just for demonstration purposes, and it'll work until I can find something that works better. To be really honest, buying artist demonstration materials, they tend to be very expensive. They're getting a little bit cheaper, but like class size demonstrators are pretty price prohibitive. So often I am making stuff and just trying to figure it out as I go along. So this is the basic wire form volumetric head on a mannequin head. Next, I'm going to use the red to start marking in the facial landmarks like the eyes, the ears, the nose, and the mouth. So typically the human face is 5 eye widths wide. If you're drawing in a cartoony or art style, more like 4, sometimes even 3. It really kind of depends on what style you have going on and how wide you want to draw the face. Typically, eyes are 1 eye width, at least 1 eye width apart, sometimes further apart. If you want kind of a wide-eyed, innocent look, they're typically further apart than 1 eye width. So halfway between the eye line and the bottom of the face is the nose, and then halfway between the nose and the bottom of the face is the mouth. And these are just approximations. Really, you can adjust them for how you like to draw your characters and for individual characters. In fact, adjusting these things and tweaking them can help prevent you from drawing same face. So one of my big complaints about this is there's no brow ridge. The eyes are not pronounced at all. They're not very inset, so they're really not particularly realistic, which makes the next exercise more of a challenge. But the ears are typically from the tops of the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose. And again, that really varies person to person. Some people have small ears, some people have large ears. These are just landmarks to kind of help you figure out how to place these things. Go ahead and point out an inaccuracy. You see that red line down at the bottom? That's supposed to be where the skull meets the neck. That should actually be right underneath the ears. So I could try to use rubbing alcohol and erase it, but that also melts styrofoam, so we're just gonna live with it. But I wanted to point it out so you guys didn't make the same mistake. Finally, I'd like to demonstrate how the eyes are inset utilizing the domino mask technique, but on this particular styrofoam head, they are not inset like at all. This person has like no brow ridge, so it was a lot more challenging to market, and it didn't make as much sense as it would on a mannequin head that has a bit more of a pronounced brow. So, you know, while this is a helpful tool for now, if you can find one that's a little bit more realistic, I would recommend going with that if you want to do this exercise at home. The one from Walmart in the craft section, not the best, although I'm kind of impressed that they sell wig heads now. And yes, this thing is actually pretty creepy. I'm well aware of that. But hopefully it mostly demonstrates the points that I've been trying to make in a way that's hopefully a little bit easier to understand now that it's on a 3D real world form. So earlier I showed you guys a volumetric head and the facial landmarks in a slightly more realistic form. Now I'm going to draw my main character from my comic, Kara, who is a more cartoony character with more stylized features, taking inspiration from both American and Japanese cartoons. I'm going to draw her utilizing this just to show you guys that there is a wide array of styles you can draw if you're utilizing volumetric construction. And I have tutorials on how to do this where I'll walk you through it step by step. But I'm also kind of breaking it down into the individual steps so you guys can kind of see how it comes together. So that is a great reminder to please remember to check the description and the cards, because there's going to be a bunch of other tutorials and demonstrations linked for you guys if you're looking for more information, or if there was something you saw that you thought sounded interesting and you want to learn more about how to do it. So I have one more exercise I want to do with you guys before I leave you guys with some assignments to help you improve your drawing. So we are going to practice drawing the face in shadow using this mannequin head, which I've conveniently marked with the different facial landmarks. So handy reference. And I'm going to have I will probably just include the video where I make this just in this video as well, because why not? Might as well have it all in one place, unless it ends up being like 3 hours again, and then I'm not going to do that. So what I want to do is I want to practice a little bit of dramatic lighting with this face, so I'm aiming for probably 3 studies. So what I don't like about this is a wig stand, and what I don't like about it is that there's just not enough definition in the facial features to get any really interesting shadows. But this is going to be a very easy exercise to kind of practice using something we have that we can actually manipulate in real life, and we can change the lighting conditions. There are lots of really interesting references online with the face in different aspects of shadow, different amounts of light, different angles. So you can Google that, and there's plenty of reference for that. That's actually something I should definitely be practicing more myself. So this is very similar to our original volumetric still life that we did at the beginning, where we did 5 different versions under different lighting conditions. This is not as successful as that, as you guys can probably see. Why? Because there are no strong facial facial features, there's nothing to really block the light. Everything is very smooth and homogeneous, and that's not just because it's made out of styrofoam, and it's just not as great a resource for doing lighting studies on the human face. Now, using a bust like a plaster bust, that is supposedly an art school staple. Lots of media about art school does it. I did not take art in high school, but I do have 2 degrees in art, and we never did it. However, I am kind of bummed out that we never did it, because I think it's probably a really useful sort of study. I think there's a lot of validity in doing those studies, and I'm going to order some plaster busts, some small ones off of Amazon, so that I can actually practice this at home, because I feel like that's a big gap in my education. And that kind of circles back to, I feel like, and maybe those of you who also went to art school, who also went to college for art, maybe you had a different experience than I did, but I feel like that's an area where a lot of art education at the higher levels assumes you had that background when you were younger, but a lot of people don't get to take art in high school for various reasons, and or they're learning at home, or they're going back to school. So I do think some of these exercises are well worth teaching, and I definitely feel the lack of those kind of fundamentals. So that's something that I want to kind of go back and address. In fact, doing these classes for you guys has been a great opportunity for me to look at my own art education, and to look at the gaps in my own art education, and to decide on exercises that I can do to help fill in those gaps. So this has been really beneficial for me. That's one of the reasons I love teaching and also doing YouTube tutorials, is I make mistakes and I fail in front of you guys, but it points out areas that I can improve on and I can focus on, and it points out new ways that I can grow and improve. And that's really exciting, and it's a great opportunity to become a better artist. In class 3 of How to Draw Anything, we really studied light. We spent a lot of time doing different exercises where we practiced drawing light and shading. And we started out with a volumetric still life under 5 different lighting conditions. And this is a great exercise. It's very cheap to do. You can do it at home. Those styrofoam shapes basically cost you like nothing. If you've got a good Dollar Tree, you can probably go buy them. I'll also have links where you can order some down in the description below. If you don't have a good Dollar Tree or a Michael's in your area, I really can't recommend this exercise enough. This is a good one. And I had a lot of fun doing it, and I learned a lot while doing it. So that's win-win. We also did a still life under those same more extreme lighting conditions, so that we could focus more on shading with various real-world objects made of various materials. Then we practiced drawing a figurine, a more humanoid figure, under those more extreme lighting conditions. And while you might not have your own Miku that you can practice drawing at home, you can buy one of those wooden artist dummies for pretty cheap. I'll link where you can get those down in the description below, and you can practice the same exercise with those as well. We also did a couple of figure studies from photographs that had more extreme lighting, and that just really wets my whistle for wanting to practice these sort of extreme lighting humanoid reference photo drawing opportunities. We did 2 fabric still life. Well, we talked a lot about drawing folds and drawing fabric, and I'll try to link that live stream for you guys. But we also did 2 draped still lifes where we used fabric draped on top of our foam forms to practice drawing different folds, again in a more extreme lighting situation. And the fabric has a surface design on it, then I highly recommend that, because it's going to make drawing the fabric a lot easier. Yes, it's more to draw, but it gives you information about how the fabric is moving. And we did this exercise twice, because I'm a big believer that repeating exercises really cements the information and you can learn more from it. We also did 3 referenced clothing drawings, outfit drawings. These were referenced from the Sartorialist, and we really focused mainly on the fabric itself as well as the shadows in the fabric. We didn't focus so much on textures at this time, but that's definitely something we could go back and study at a later date. We also talked about drawing the human head using volumetric construction. I've got some more in-depth tutorials on how to draw the human head using this that I hope you guys will check out. I just wanted to kind of touch on it. This deserves plenty of time and care and attention because once you know how to do it, it really makes drawing the head a lot easier. And then we ended with lighting studies using that weird wig mannequin head with those way too soft facial features. And this is an exercise that I want to revisit with you guys once I have some plaster busts because I think there's a lot of value to it, but I was not able to capture a lot of value in this one. So we drew a lot today. I had a lot of fun with this class. I had a lot of fun with all three of these classes. I hope you guys did too. If you haven't checked out class 1 and class 2 of how to draw anything, I'll have those linked in the cards as well as down in the description below. I think you guys will really enjoy them. If you're looking for more how to draw tutorials, I've got you covered. I've got a favorite drawing tutorials playlist. I've also got a bunch of comic drawing tutorials here and just comic tutorials here on the channel. I will link all of those down in the description below, and I hope you guys will take the time to check them out, especially if you're looking for some more drawing help. I'm also going to link some drawing resources for you guys that'll take you a little bit further than what I was gonna do today. So if you are one of my amazing patrons on Patreon, first off, thank you guys so much for your support. Second of all, not only will you get early access to this class, but you're also going to get the presentation that my in-person students at the St. Charles Parish Public Library got, and you're also going to get the printables that they got. And those two things are, outside of that class, backer exclusive as a thanks for all the support that you guys give me. So if you are new here, if this is your first time hanging out with me, that's super cool. Hopefully you guys had a good time. I hope you'll consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to see more from me in the future. I've got lots of great drawing, watercolor, alcohol marker tutorials, as well as art supply reviews to help you guys make art a habit because it's really important to me. I want to make art more accessible to more people. So if you are on board with that mission, hopefully you guys will subscribe and stick around for more art tutorials. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I hope to see you guys again really soon. Enormous thanks to these awesome people. Tutorials like this absolutely would not be feasible without their help and support. Thank you guys so much. Hopefully I'll see you guys again soon. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.